Mama, is God real?
Is marriage for life?
Do we have to be baptized?
Is drinking really wrong?
Well, that's your interpretation.
Where do I come from?
Do we really have to have authority for what we do?
Where is God when I need him?
Rise up, O men of God. His kingdom tarries long. Bring him the day of brotherhood and in the night of wrong.
Hello, friends, and welcome again to the Shield of Faith. My name is Wes Garland, and I am the preacher for the Sequatchie Valley Church of Christ in Pikeville, Tennessee, and we have along with us Barry Kennedy.
Good to be here.
He is the preacher of the Crossville Church of Christ in Crossville, Tennessee. We also have with us, as always, Eric Pitcock.
Hey, Wes.
He is the preacher of the Northwest Church of Christ in Clay County, Tennessee. And for the next 30 minutes, we hope and pray that you'll take out your Bible, paper, and pen, because we are continuing the study on Satan. And we've already talked about in previous episodes his reality and nature, as well as in our last episode we talked about deception and one of the three ways that he works. And today we are going to be discussing seduction. Now, guys, whenever you really think about seduction, we need to first realize really what it is. Seduction simply means to entice or temptation. It's something in which a person is carried away in and held on to. Whenever you think about seduction, a lot of times we think about sexuality things. Whenever we think about seduction, being seduced into something, a lot of times people think about sexual. That is one point. But we need to realize and open up our minds that seduction is not something that's only sexual, but it's also something that can be carried away by doctrine and things of that nature, which we'll discuss today.
It's something that appeals to the desire.
Exactly.
The term desire comes into play when you're looking at this, and it could be, there's nothing more seductive than a good piece of chocolate cake to a person who's on a diet. Mm-hmm. I mean,
you can be seduced.
He's seduced. He wants to eat that. Don't stare at the refrigerator if you're on a diet. Those kind of things, you know, you can see it in that. That's an area totally separate from sexual temptation, but it's still a seduction.
It is. It is. It is this. The very first place, guys, we need to think about this text is James chapter 1. Because in all reality, we need to realize, and we haven't actually said this in our previous statements, temptation itself is not the sinful thing. If temptation was sinful, then our Savior Jesus Christ, even though he was tempted in Matthew chapter 4, meant that he then sinned. The temptation is not what is wrong, but the follow through with the temptation is what is wrong and makes it to be sin, and just like what we're about to discuss here in James
One note on that before we go further with that. The only way a temptation would be sin is if I'm tempting someone myself to do evil.
Exactly.
Therefore, I would be sinning in that, laying a stumbling block, and so on and so forth. But the temptation itself is nothing but a temptation. And then it's when we conform to that, when we give into it, as you're going to read in James, that's when we sin.
Thank you for the clarification on that. Whenever we think about in James chapter 1, beginning in verse number 12, he says, "Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed." It says, "Then when the desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death." So understanding this whole entire text, we understand here that temptation is not the thing that's wrong, but temptation is only temptation.
Right.
But whenever we are brought about with a temptation, it's brought about by our own desires, our own lusts. And just as what we've been defining in 1 John chapter 2, verse 16, the lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, those evil desires within ourselves, that's what brings about the temptation. But those temptations then are brought about, the thing that makes it wrong is when we become enticed with it.
Well, the lust is it's a longing.
It is.
When you look at the word lust, it carries an idea of longing, and then you got this enticed idea is alluring. It reminds me of fishing. And you put the lure on to entice the fish to strike. And that's what temptation to sin is. It's this allurement that's pulling us in, and it draws our attention, just like the fish sees food. But it's a trap. It's a trap.
That's right. That's right. And even in this text, that's exactly the picture that he's trying to give to it. In all reality, whenever we fish, why do we use certain lures?
Because it's tempting.
It's tempting. I mean, we put on there a specific lure for the fish that we're wanting to catch.
It's deceiving.
That is. I mean, we understand that that's the weakness. That's what they go after. And that's the same exact way Satan himself works.
Right.
And we have to remember. Oh, he's got a big tackle box. And this is the thing. Since we are drawn away by our own desires, that's the thing. Just as the fish himself is desiring a certain food, and there's certain things that a certain fish will not touch.
That's right.
And that's why we have to study our fish if we want to catch that fish and figure out what lure to throw in. And that's the same exact way that Satan works right here. Now,
In that sense, he's a lot busier studying us than we are him.
Yeah.
oh, that's true. That is very, very true. But we need to really understand this. Even though those evil desires do come upon us and those evil lusts and things, we long for those things. But the Bible also says in Proverbs 1 and verse number 10 that he says, "My son, if sinners entice thee, do not consent." And if you just do a little study all the way through the book of Proverbs, there's so many times he talks about the seducing woman and things of that nature. And the instruction that he gives to his son is don't even go near her, do not go anywhere to her. And this is the thing we have to realize. Seduction is one of those things that we have to realize that if it's there, if we have that evil desire, do not even think about going that route.
God has given us a conscience. Now, a conscience is not our only guide. A conscience can be trained. It can be seared with a hot iron. We talked about in a previous session. But looking at this conscience, it is a gift from God. In most cases, if our conscience is telling us this is not a good idea, it's best to listen. It's best to avoid that. And when we see that in matters that would affect us physically, and we use the illustrations, preachers have used these illustrations many times. You take communion cups. Most of us, have multiple communion cups and so on and so forth. And you say you have 1,000 communion cups in these trays, and only one of them has strychnine in it. Which one? Will you drink any of them? I don't know where it's at. I'm not going to drink any of them for the sheer fact that I might get that one. Now, the odds are in my favor that I won't get that one, but I'm not going to do that because of the danger that's sin is more deadly than strychnine. And it's a lot more alluring, a lot more enticing. And that's why he says over and over again, like these, don't consent, avoid this, flee, what we mentioned in earlier, flee fornication. Run from it, get as far away from it as you can, not how close can we get to it.
None of us would have a problem with the devil and sin if these elements wasn't in place. This is what makes it a problem.
Right.
This is why we're told to flee from these things. This is why we're told to avoid, even the appearance of evil. That's why we're continuously warned and told to beware and to steer away from sin, is because it is seducing. It is enticing. Even you don't have to go look for sin for it to find you. There's always seemingly a way that it just seems to just pop up that it's ever present. It's always a danger that's before us of being, like James says, of being enticed, lured away of our own lust. And if we're not careful, we will do just exactly what that text says, and we will be drawn away after our own lust, and we will engage in that activity, and then we will have sinned as a result of that.
And just as you said, it doesn't take long for you to find temptation or temptation to find you. It's very interesting, even talking about the battle that's within our mortal man, being also fighting against our spiritual man as well. Romans chapter 7, going there where he says the things that I wish I would not, I find myself doing, and the things that I wish I would do, I find myself not doing. It's that constant battle with that. The temptation's always there. So that's why we have to then prepare ourselves in that.
You go back to the very beginning.
Yeah.
How long had Adam and Eve been in the garden before the serpent comes? We're not given that, but it seems to be a relatively short time. And look at what he does. He comes in, he says, we talked about earlier sessions, you shall not surely die. But that wasn't enough temptation to get her to eat. Just the fact that you won't die if you eat this wasn't enough. He says, God's holding back something. He
something.
starts
That's
seducing
right.
her now. God's holding you back. If you eat of this, he knows you'll be like him. Knowing good and evil is what the King James Version says. Well, she knew already it was evil to eat of the tree. She knew it was good not to eat of the tree. So what does he mean? I believe if you look at it in the context, you look at what he's talking about, you're going to be like God. You determine what's good and what's evil. Is that a temptation to man?
Yes.
That's very seductive. If I get to set the standard, I'm the one who gets to set the rules and determine what's right and what's wrong. I like that. And that's why the condemnation comes to the children of Israel from Isaiah. Woe to them that call good evil and evil good.
That's right.
Put bitter
And
for
so-
sweet and sweet for
Right.
bitter.
And so that tactic that he used, that God is somehow holding something back from
Right.
you, that there's something out there that you can't have that you would be benefited by having.
The grass is always greener on the other
That's
side.
right. That's exactly, man.
Common
that is a
phrase
tactic
used.
that we use, that the Satan uses to this day. There's always that he tries to appeal to that sense of, there's something that you're missing out on. If you don't participate in some of the activities that maybe your peers are engaged in, be it drinking or fornication or going to certain places, and if you're not engaged in that, well, you're missing out on something. You're not having fun. You're not cutting loose. You're not, it's amazing to me that it seems as though that the world's perception is that the only way that you can have fun is to sin. And what I have come to understand is that's not only false and against what the Scripture teaches me, that it's actually the most fun to be a Christian and to live the
It's the
right
most
kind of
fulfilling
life.
life.
That's right. It's the most fulfilling life, and those that desire to commit those things and to be involved in those things, that's just, it's really a lie. They have been seduced by the devil.
And, I just talk about what you were just saying. I remember an instructor at the school of preaching that I went to, and one of the instructors was talking about how people talk about how you're missing out on things and things like that. He said, I was asked one time about it from an individual. He says, dude, have you ever slept around with anybody? And he goes, I've only had my wife. And he goes, dude, you have no idea what you're missing out on. He goes, I'm not missing out on anything. I'm having the joys of having that with my wife.
1 Corinthians 6.
Yes.
1
Corinthians 6.
Flee
Exactly.
fornication. Verse 18, every sin that a man doeth is without the body, but he that committeth fornication sinneth against his own flesh.
That's right.
That's right. And even going...
Hurting yourself.
That's right. And it's interesting whenever you really go through, how we've already talked about this, seduction can be sexual. Like in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife,
That's
and
right.
let every woman have her own husband. Understanding that fornication is something that's not supposed to be there, but the desire can be there, and if that's a problem, then that needs to be taken care of. But it's interesting, even through Proverbs 5, all through chapter 7, I think it's interesting, if you turn to chapter 7, throughout this whole entire thing, he's talking about the sexual desire for the adulterous woman. And going on down through here, how it says that the woman met him with the attire of a harlot and a crafty heart, things, and she was loud and rebellious, things in verse number 10. I want you to just listen to this. She was loud and rebellious. Her feet would not stay at home. At times she was outside, at times in the open square, lurking at every corner, talking about that it was everywhere, looking for him. And it says, so she caught him and kissed him with an impudent face. She said to him, I have peace offerings with me today. I have paid my vows, so I came out to meet you diligently to seek your face, and I have found you. I have spread my bed with tapestry, colored coverings of Egyptian linen. I have perfumed my bed with myrrh and aloes and cinnamon. Come, let us take our fill of love until morning. Let us delight ourselves with love, for my husband is not at home. He has gone on a long journey. He has taken a bag of money with him and will come home on an appointed day. With her enticing speech, she caused him to yield. Now, did she make him do that? No. He went on through with it himself. With her flattering lips, she seduced him. Immediately he went in after her as an ox goes to the slaughter. Now notice the terminology here. As the ox goes to the slaughter, as a fool to the correction of the stocks, till an arrow struck his liver. As a bird hastens to the snare, he did not know it would cost him his life.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Now this is interesting. The reason why people are so seduced into these things is that they do not think about the reality of what's going to happen after this. What's the result of all this?
Mm-hmm.
Because if we really think about it, would it be as tempting if we really realized this could cost me a lot?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it would be as tempting. Just a quick answer to that. Okay. Yes, it is, because sin is pleasurable.
Yes.
We were talking in between sessions about Hebrews chapter 11 and Moses. He chose to suffer persecution with the children of God than to enjoy the pleasures
of sin.
Yeah, and it is pleasurable. Yeah. So yes, it is as tempting. Now, whether or not we're going to give in to that, that's the different story. You look at this person here in Proverbs that he's writing, that Solomon's writing to his son, and giving him this encouragement, and so on and so forth. What we're seeing here in Proverbs, you have practical application in the man Joseph.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Joseph was tempted. He was pressed on daily by Potiphar's wife. Mm-hmm. Right? She tried to get him with all of these things, and there's no doubt a man of his stature and his power would have had a beautiful wife, most likely in that culture.
Sure.
But that wasn't it. He said, I can't sin against, your husband's given me everything, in charge of everything except for you. Mm-hmm. And I can't do this against, number one, God. I can't do this against him. And he also had himself in here. Yeah. I can't even do this against myself. And if anybody had what the world would say a right to do this, that would have to be Joseph. Mm-hmm. I've tried to live a godly life. God's been speaking to me with these visions and telling me what's going to be in the future. And my brothers want me dead. Mm-hmm. They sell me as a slave. They lie to my father.
I'm pity me.
Yeah.
Type situation. Yeah.
But he didn't give in.
No.
He ran from her.
That's right.
One of the things that we could draw from this in Proverbs 7 and the example of Joseph is, I think we need to caution ourselves, men and women, to not only protect ourselves from being seduced, but to beware of being a seducer.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Because it can be the case that I can ignorantly and not knowingly be an individual that is seducing someone else because of my actions and because of the things that I do. Particularly, what comes to mind is the way that I dress. Mm-hmm. I think about ladies and how they dress, and I know. I know that there are individuals that don't take into consideration what they are wearing and how that how that seduces other individuals.
And the number one goal behind that should be what I'm wearing, what I say, what I do. Does this show godliness?
That's right.
Exactly.
Is this going to tell
godliness.
Right? Professing godliness. Mm-hmm. I give benefit of the doubt. I believe most people in the religious sphere, I guess you use that term, in ladies particularly, most of them do what they do and dress for fashion sense.
That's right.
And not thinking about this. Mm-hmm. But we've got to stop back and think, is this going to show godliness? Mm-hmm. Is this going to profess? Are you going to see, is this person who sees me dressed this way or doing these things, is it going to say to them, I'm a child of God?
Yeah. Because look at how this harlot was dressed. Mm-hmm. I mean, she obviously
it factored in.
That's right. She obviously she had ill intentions. I mean, she wanted something to happen that was wrong. But we could take those same principles, the way she was dressed, the way she was acting, and do we see individuals that call themselves Christians acting in those kinds of ways?
Sure.
Well, certainly we do.
Sure.
And I think we have to not only beware of being seduced, but being the seducer as well, and encouraging those individuals in the congregations where we're at to be modest and to live godly lives.
Let's go on from the sexual side of things, and let's move on to understanding that we can also be seduced doctrinally.
Right.
And one passage that I could really think about is 1 Timothy chapter 4, in verse number 1, where it says, Now the Spirit expressingly says that in latter times some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons. Now this is also even something that's mentioned here in Revelation chapter 2, how he says that they have some there that hold the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, which I hate, and all these other things. These individuals were being carried away and enticed with temptation that it's all right to carry with those things. They can hold to those things and still be pleasing unto God. And I think it's important for them to realize the reason why the Lord addressed those things to the congregation.
For the same reason we see in 2 John verse 9, whosoever transgresseth and abideth not in the doctrine of Christ hath not God. He that abideth in the doctrine of Christ hath both the Father and the Son. And then he goes on talking about if you bid God speed or God be with you in what you're doing, to anyone who's holding those doctrines, you become a partaker, and notice the word, of their evil deeds.
That's right.
Evil deeds.
That's right.
God calls false doctrine evil.
And you know, Satan is the master of deception, and as far as doctrinally speaking, it's like I think we alluded to this in a previous segment where we discussed the subject of once saved, always saved, and how that is a very wholesome doctrine, a very comforting doctrine. Well, that's seducing the people. That's you know, that would cause an individual to move towards that. That's easy. That's simple. You know, and they could be easily seduced by that. And there's so many other things that could be applicable in terms of doctrinally that sounds good to individuals. You know, like Paul told Timothy that people will be drawn away. They're having itching ears. They turn unto fables. You know, why would they do that? Well, because it's seducing. You know, it's alluring. It's crafty. It's cunning. That's all the tactics and the tools and the wiles of the devil. He's the master of counterfeit. You know, he's the master of division. You know, Paul writing to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 1, 10 through 13, he warned them about division and encouraged them to all speak the same thing. Right. You know, and we'll go ahead.
But just like with the division or the deception we talked about in our last issue or segment, the seduction, deception, all of these things, every lie has to have a little truth. If it's going to be accepted, if it's going seduction, there's some good in this. We're talking about the sexual thing, we're talking about doctrine. There's good doctrine, there's good, you know, sexual relationships within the confines of marriage. That's a gift from God. Marriage is honorable and all in the bed undefiled, Paul or the Hebrew writer would say. So looking back at this in the doctrine, there's a true doctrine. The whole point behind having a counterfeit is there's an original that's valuable. And that's why we want the original, but we don't want what it takes to get the original. We want a shortcut and make an easier route, thus false doctrine, seduction.
When somebody makes counterfeit money, they have to always go by the standard first.
Right.
Because if it was something that was totally different, it would never be accepted. It automatically be...
It has to look similar.
Exactly. You know, not only can it be sexually, it can also be done doctrinally. It can also be done by just different various lusts. And this is also found in 2 Timothy chapter 3, talking about the perilous times. Notice what it says here, beginning in verse number 1. He says this, "But know this, that in the last times perilous times will come, for men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. From such turn away." He says, "For of this sort are those who creep into households and make captives of gullible women, loaded down with sins, led away by various lusts, always learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth." I mean, it is totally possible to be so seduced into something that you never come to the truth. I mean, just as what I've said in previous segments, I mean, I've sat down and studied with individuals who I have made it as simple as it could possibly be, even drawn it out for them and everything so they could even see it. But they are so seduced within their own doctrines, they can't give it up.
Well, we can't prove evolution.
No.
But the academia as a whole has accepted it because they cannot accept God.
Exactly.
That's the only reason we'll accept this is because we cannot accept God.
Exactly. Let's just ask this question as we have just a few more minutes left. How can we prevent seduction? How can we prevent it?
Well, in the home, we could, the husband and wife needs to portray their God-given roles that God has given them.
Amen.
In the way that God has told them to do so. They need to instruct their children. They need to be the parents, and they need to show them what is right, what is wrong. They need to do what they can to help their children and themselves avoid, to flee, and to turn away from sin. There are practical things that can be done. You know, we watch. We be careful the places that we go. We be careful of the things that we watch on television. We be careful of the things and be mindful of the things that we're taking into our minds, into our hearts, because those in turn can become action if we allow them to.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, in terms of the home through entertainment,
we need to be more parents than we are our friends.
Yeah.
Well, and another one of those quick answers to the question itself, how can we prevent seduction? The only way we can prevent it is to totally lose lust.
Mm-hmm.
But we can't do that. No. So what you're saying is, how do we deal with it more so? And those are good illustrations. Examples, Psalm 101 verse 3, the psalmist said, I will set no wicked thing before mine eyes. I hate the works of them that turn aside, and notice then, it will not cleave to me. Now, when you think about this, the responsibility I have, I'm not going to put it in front of myself. I like a statement that I use for myself. I try to tell others, if I put myself in a compromising situation, I will compromise. I've said it here before as well. When I'm doing that, I'm putting myself halfway into the sin itself already, because I'm placing myself in a place where I shouldn't be. I will set no wicked thing before my eyes, because it will turn me aside if I do. It will cleave to me if I do, so I've got to make up my mind beforehand, I'm not going to do this. Joseph didn't wait till he was tempted to decide he wasn't going to fornicate with someone else's wife. Right? Daniel didn't wait until he was taken captive in Babylon before he decided he wasn't going to eat of those things and defile himself. He made his mind up beforehand, and that's what we have to do as well. Parenting.
I've even heard, even whenever I was a preacher there at Northwest, of an individual who said, well, to try to say that the prom's all right and things of that nature, and going to the ocean during the hot times and stuff like that, seeing the immodesty. The individual said, well, we need to prepare our children to just go ahead and face the facts on things. So trying to justify saying, well, they're going to do it sometime or whatever, you've got to test your children sometime. So go ahead and throw them in that situation to really test them. That's not being a parent. No. Because why would you want to send your child into something that is ungodly in this whole situation?
That
to
same
say,
parent,
I want to challenge you.
That same parent would not say, I want to have my son go spend some time with the drug dealer down here.
Exactly.
He wouldn't do that.
No.
It's an emotional argument.
It is.
Yeah.
Because you're talking about getting into my entertainment. And entertainment is the god of our society today.
Yeah.
We feel that it's our right, it's our responsibility that we are to be entertained. And entertainment's an option.
That's right.
It's an option.
You know, as we draw this to a conclusion, I've got just a couple of verses here, just real quick. When it comes to the sexual seduction, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse number 4, verses 3 and 4, that for this is the will of God, your sanctification, that you should abstain from sexual immorality, that each of you should know how to possess your own vessel in sanctification and honor. Talking about we need to first understand how we deal with ourselves, but number two, brethren, we need faithful leaders in the church.